Welcome to Hub TV, the Resilience Channel, broadcasting from Eastern Africa. In this series on the elasticity of democracy, we will address the question of violence in the 2017 general election in Kenya. Because of the memory of the 2008 post-election violence, elections in Kenya have come to be viewed as a potential trigger for impending state collapse. The European Union Observer Mission for the 2017 election and Kenya's National Cohesion and Integration Commission have already indicated that there will be violence during this year's general election. However, research by the Violence Observatory hosted by the Eastern Africa Resilience Innovation Hub shows that this year's election will attract only limited levels of ethnically motivated electoral violence. We have found that the violence that the country will experience will largely arise out of local contestations. The violence will be opportunistic, localized, and for the most part, intra-ethnic. In undertaking this research, the Violence Observatory clustered the 47 counties of Kenya into 8 convergences. Then we applied a violence index to denote the probability and intensity of violence in each of these convergences. Red convergences have a high probability of experiencing high voltage violence. Amber convergences have a high probability of electoral violence, but the intensity of it will be low. Green convergences have a low probability of any notable violence at all. In this episode, we will present the violence index for the different parts of the country based on a 3-point framework that identifies the root causes of the violence, the triggers of the violence, and the drivers that will sustain the violence if it occurs.
The violence index for the Kavirondo convergence is red. If the recent report by the National Cohesion and Integration Commission is anything to go by, 7 out of the 10 counties that are in this convergence have been classified as problematic and at risk of violence. These are Kisumu, Narok, Kericho, Kisii, Homa Bay, Bungoma, and Migori. In other words, 70% of this convergence lies on the brink of violence, according to the NCIC. But this is not the only reason. When we read it against the historical patterns of ethnic and political violence in Kenya as reflected in the Kiliku, Akiwumi, Waki, and Krigler reports, what emerges is that the counties in this convergence feature consistently on the violence map. An even closer inspection reveals 2 things. 1, there are entrenched political, social, and economic grievances in these counties. And 2, there is a historical proliferation of armed militia groups in these counties. For instance, in Busia, the Baghdad gangsters, Bulanda Boys, and Marachi Revolution Council are armed groups that have been identified by security agencies as mobilizing to engage in political violence in this coming general election. However, the violence, if it occurs, will be concentrated in specific spaces. For instance, Kisumu, Migori, and Homa Bay will almost certainly experience violence. History has shown that violent protest inevitably occurs in these regions if a preferred presidential candidate does not win the election. In addition, the violence patterns observed during the party nominations in these counties was also very high. Other counties such as Kakamega and Bungoma are classified as amber in the violence index. And this is because in the absence of a local leader vying for the presidency, the electorate is not as fervently invested in the outcome of the presidential election. Instead, violence is likely to be triggered by the outcome of local elections. And because the contestants in these local elections are of a similar ethnicity, the voltage of the violence is likely to be low. Now, since the counties in Luo Nyanza and Western are generally homogeneous from an ethnic standpoint, it means that the probability of inter-ethnic violence will also be low. A similar argument can be made for Kisii, Nyamira, and Kericho, but with the caveat that ethnic divisions along the eastern borderlines of these counties are a potential flashpoint for violence between politically polarized communities.
The Mambao convergence consists of the counties Lamu, Tana River, Kilifi, Kwale, Mombasa, and Taita Taveta. The convergence is characterized by its proximity to the Indian Ocean and its border with Somalia, where Al-Shabaab has waged an insurgency against the Kenyan government since 2006. On the violence index, the Mambao convergence is red. Lamu, Garissa, and Tana River are under government curfew till October this year. Kwale and Likoni in Mombasa are also some of the areas that the government has designated as potential violent hotspots in the run-up to the general election. Instances of violence are steadily increasing as we near the general election, and the violence so far is targeting government security agencies. In early July in Lamu, Al-Shabaab militants raided Jima and Pandangoa villages. Earlier in the same week, 3 police officers were killed in an attack on a police post. A few days later, July 18th, Al-Shabaab attacked the Mokoe GSU camp in Lamu West. The other reason this convergence is red on the violence index is that there's a high level of political contestation and increased incitement by political leaders who exploit the simmering tensions to settle political scores. For instance, Kwale is a multi-ethnic county that is home to a large population that are not indigenous to the coastal region and who have been targeted on occasion for violence following incitement by politicians. We at the Hub argue that there could also be a convergence of interests between the indigenous coastal communities and the Al-Shabaab. That is, the Al-Shabaab are using deep-seated grievances such as land ownership to co-opt locals and vulnerable youth into their extremist views and into violent action. The issue of land remains a cause of enduring grievances in the convergence that can then be easily manipulated to trigger violence.
Now we turn to the Mau convergence. This convergence consists of 6 counties, namely Nakuru, Baringo, Elgeyo Marakwet, Uasin Gishu, Nandi, and Kericho, all located in Kenya's Rift Valley. The convergence is predominantly occupied by 4 ethnic groups: the Kalenjin, the Kikuyu, Luya, and Luo. We predict that violence in this convergence will not be related to the presidential elections. Instead, it will be driven by other factors that are historical in nature, such as long-standing grievances, inter- and intra-community tensions, the presence of armed militia groups, the significant degree of gun permeation, the perennial competition for resources, and numerous land boundary disputes. For instance, Uasin Gishu, Nandi, and Kericho, which border Western and Nyanza regions, periodically experience violent conflict. The traditional hotspots in this area include Naivasha and Molo in Nakuru, Turbo in Uasin Gishu, Fort Tenan in Kericho, Kamasai and Owiro in Nandi County, amongst others. Politically motivated triggers of violence will be localized, meaning that they will be driven by contestations at the county level. This convergence has also witnessed periodic acts of violence in the recent past, such as the Kapedo massacre and the murder of 3 Baringo politicians in 2017. For these reasons, the convergence is categorized as high amber on the violence index. Baringo and Nakuru in particular are singled out as red zones.
The Ma convergence consists of Kajiado and Narok counties, and it scores amber on the violence index. And we say this because these counties are battlegrounds for the presidential vote, and this has split the resident communities along party lines. The precursor to the anticipated violence are the ODM and Jubilee nominations in Kajiado and Narok, both of which were marred by allegations of rigging and theft of ballot papers. This scenario may replay itself in the general election, where perceptions of ballot rigging are a potential trigger for violence. There are 3 potential factors for conflict in this convergence: inequitable distribution of county resources, competition for scarce resources, and incitement by politicians. The first 2 potential drivers are historical, and although they remain unresolved, they have been used by politicians to balkanize the indigenous and settler communities in these counties. Because both the politicians and the electorate are heavily invested in the outcome of the local elections, preliminary research by the Violence Observatory noted that political violence could be used to influence voting at the county level, and violence may occur due to fallouts over the elections for county governor. However, the probability of ethnic violence in the Ma convergence is low because the bulk of the aspirants for public positions all hail from the Ma community. This means that the divisions are internal and fall along clan lines.
The Northern Frontier and the Loki convergences are both categorized as high amber on the violence index. This means that their potential for violence is high, both in probability and intensity. The counties in the Loki convergence are Turkana, West Pokot, Samburu, and Isiolo, while the counties in the Northern Frontier convergence are Marsabit, Mandera, and Wajir. A primary finding is that the issues that cut across both convergences are not related to the upcoming election. The issues are instead based on pre-existing factors, including intercommunity tension and historical grievances such as widely perceived marginalization by the central government. Other issues have to do with the convergence's geographical placement. Because of the region's proximity to the borders, there are high levels of gun permeation. As a result, there is a large presence of armed militia groups, also as a self-securing mechanism given the absence and/or abstinence of state security agencies. It is worth noting, however, that although these issues are not directly related to the election, they can be activated by incitement from political actors who would exploit them to get elected. In the Loki convergence, two counties are red zones, Isiolo and Turkana. This is because their county-level politics will be highly competitive. This is partly driven by a high-stakes competition for access to new resources, namely oil in Turkana and lapset in Isiolo. Additionally, in Isiolo, tribal politics is at play with 5 different ethnic groups competing for county leadership.
Mount Kenya convergence covers 7 counties: Nairobi, Laikipia, Embu, Murang'a, Nyeri, Kirinyaga, and Kiambu. All the 7 counties in the convergence are green, except Laikipia and Nairobi, which are amber. And this is why. In Nairobi, carriers of violence will be militia groups that have been mobilized along tribal lines. These militia groups that have been dormant are now being reanimated by politicians, especially those running for office at the local level. Furthermore, new infrastructural corridors like the Southern Bypass go through traditional violence hotspots where some of these militia groups are concentrated. This means that there is potential to cause disruption of transportation corridors to neighboring countries. Laikipia scores amber on the violence index due to the pre-existing conflict between pastoralist communities and settlers in the area. Our findings indicate that the conflict has escalated as a result of incitement by local politicians. Violent conflict in the pre-election period is a possible precursor to the intensification of complex violence during the election period that will aim to achieve a range of objectives, including forceful displacement of certain communities, repossession of ranch lands, and establishment of a new political order. The other 5 counties in this convergence, namely Kiambu, Murang'a, Nyeri, Kirinyaga, and Embu, have a low likelihood of violence, and therefore our reading is green. These regions are ethnically and politically homogeneous, and the level of contestation at the presidential level is almost non-existent.
The Daab convergence consists of Kitui, Tana River, and Garissa counties. According to our research, this convergence scores an amber on the violence index. Although the likelihood of conflict in this convergence is present, it is likely to remain localized and may not necessarily find expression in national politics. The immediacy of conflict in this violence is dependent on 2 factors. One, the outcome of the county elections, and particularly the distribution of ethnic leaders within the county governments. And 2, the fragile security situation in Garissa and Tana River, which further complicates the security outlook for this convergence. Given the history of Al-Shabaab activity in Garissa County, it is possible that the terrorist group may attempt to mount attacks targeting voter concentrations and then disguise them as political conflict. Similarly, pre-existing ethnic tensions may find room to play out in Tana River County, especially for the lower level seats where the rival communities may be overlapping.
In conclusion, of the 7 convergences, 1 convergence, the Kavirondo convergence, scored red on the violence index. We predict that the counties in this convergence will most certainly experience violence around the conduct of local elections. We have also found that if the outcome of the presidential election is not as expected, we will witness violent protests in these spaces. 1 convergence, Mount Kenya convergence, scored green on the violence index, meaning it is unlikely that there will be violence in this convergence. And 5 convergences scored amber on the violence index. This means that although the probability of violence in the amber convergences is high, should it occur, it will arise out of contestations for the local county seats. Any dissatisfaction with the outcome of the presidential election will take the form of riots and protests, which will be concentrated in the major urban centers. As a result, the overall finding of the Eastern Africa Resilience Hub is that ethnically motivated electoral violence will be limited during this general election. And this is not because ethnic tensions are absent, but because the geography does not favor it. Unlike the 2007 election, the communities that are most politically polarized due to their investment in the presidency are not in close proximity to one another. They are located in parts of the country that are far apart, with buffer communities between them that do not constitute a primary target.